My name is Justin Jennings, ROM curator and the host of for today's Curator's Conversation, a digital program that explores ROM-related themes with industry professionals. And so I'd like to thank, before I begin, TD for their ongoing support of this program. And I'd also like to begin by acknowledging that the ROM sits on the ancestral lands of the Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe Nation, including the Mississauga, the Credit First Nation. I'm pleased to be joined by Dr. Joanna Henderson, Director of the Center for Child, Youth, and Family Mental Health at CAMH, as well as Executive Director of Youth Wellness Hubs Ontario. She works to improve mental health services for youth and their families. So welcome, Joanna. And I'm also joined by Emily Stegweit, a music therapist that serves as manager at the Canadian Musical Therapy Fund. In her clinical work, she uses music therapy to restore, maintain, and improve the mental, physical, and emotional health of Canadians. So welcome as well, Emily. So in April of 2021, the ROM asked youth across Ontario to share their feelings and stories of pandemic life. 2,300 artists answered our call, laying bare many of their struggles, hopes, and anxieties, and shared their experiences through music, dance, portraits, sculpture, and other media. So I have three questions then for our two distinguished panelists. So first, as mental health specialists, what are some of the impacts of the pandemic that you've seen on youth and their families? And we'll start with Joanna.
Excellent. Thank you, Justin. And thanks for hosting this really important conversation today. I think there are really two pieces to this conversation. One that's really around what we see overall, and then there's really at the level of the individual. So overall, we have seen young people struggle. We've seen many young people experiencing difficulties in terms of social connectedness, disruptions to development, the things that characterize everything from peer relationships to getting your driver's license have been disrupted. And when development and these milestones get disrupted, then young people can really struggle in that context. But the other piece of that is the pandemic is also a very individual experience. And at the individual level, in fact, young people are having experiences that span from very negative to also very positive. And many young people that we've talked to said, we also have to talk about some of the positive things that have come out of the pandemic, the ways in which we've learned to cope, the ways in which we've spent more time with family, or maybe some relief we felt from mental health struggles that happen in the context of school, or exposure to bullying that might happen in the context of school. Really, we need to understand that there isn't one story. In fact, it's quite diverse across our community of young people and families.
Excuse me, muted again. Emily, what are your thoughts then on this?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, thank you so much for hosting us, Justin, and so happy to be here with you today to be talking about this. I think jumping off of what Joanna was saying, there are certainly trends that I've seen in the work with that I do with my clients. I think, on top of youth mental health struggling in various ways, we also have families and parents who are struggling not only with their own mental health and coping with, strains of pandemic life, maybe working at home, especially, at the height of lockdown with kids at home, also navigating having their children at home while trying to work, or having their children at home when they have to go to work for people who weren't able to work from home. And so experiencing their own mental health challenges, which then impact their entire family system. And also parents who are then looking for more resources and opportunities to support their children's mental health for people who have kids who are struggling as well. And so it's really been something that's affected, the entire family system, and you can't really touch one person in the family probably without impacting the others, right? And then I think also thinking about the ways that experiences have really varied, we need to look at the ways, and I've really noticed the ways that the pandemic has disproportionately impacted certain segments of our population, right? So we do think about youth. We think about seniors who are in long-term care, who were really isolated for such a long time. We think about people who maybe don't have reliable internet access or ways to connect with people virtually. And so in lockdown was particularly isolating for those folks. And so, yeah, I think I would agree with Joanna that there's sort of these broad trends that we're seeing and also these really individualized experiences.
So thank you. So in a way, we've talked about then what's happened, sort of all the strains that we're under. I want to talk next, the second question is about coping mechanisms. What are some of the things that we've developed over the last 18 months in order to deal with some of the mental strains of pandemic life? And this time I'll start with you, Emily.
Yeah, I'm really happy to touch on this sort of from the perspective of music therapy and also from the perspective of the ways that people have really dived into their creative pursuits. And so this is something that I think we all really noticed, particularly right at the beginning of the pandemic when things were really locked down and lots of people were spending time at home. People may have been out of work and had a lot more time on their hands to explore things that they maybe weren't exploring when they were busy with work life. And I think, you know, this isolation has really forced us to be creative in the ways that we connect with other people and the ways that we process our emotions and have outlets for self-expression. So, you know, in some ways I think about music and the arts, but creative pursuits could also be things like baking, which was still, I mean, I think still is pretty big for a lot of people, but we saw all kinds of people baking bread, you know, getting outdoors, creative ways to connect with other people, you know, even adapting to this way of connecting virtually with other people. And when we look at youth, I think specifically too of TikTok, like look at the explosion that this platform had, particularly with Gen Z, over the course of the pandemic. And maybe that explosion was inevitable. Maybe this platform would have taken off anyways. But I think that sort of creative aspect of this platform in particular was really appealing to Gen Z and has really, you know, for all the positives and negatives of social media, one positive I think is having these ways to connect with other people and these outlets for creative expression that have been so important to all of us, I think, over the last 18 months.
Well, thank you. And Joanna, what are some thoughts on the coping mechanisms we've developed?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with Emily. And, you know, one of the things that's really important, both for young people, but also for family members, like everyone, is really paying attention to the basics. That's a good place to start. So sleeping, eating, exercise. And I think, you know, one of the things, and I don't know, Emily, if you would agree, but building something like music or other aspects of the arts into your regular day-to-day routine can really be a way of centering self-care. And when Emily talked about the importance of family mental health, as opposed to always thinking, you know, individual mental health, that's a critical point. Family members have an opportunity to model for their young people good coping. And they do that by what they say, but most importantly, by what they do. And so when we can, as adults, engage in healthy coping behavior, we're sending important signals and teaching the children and young people in our lives important lessons about how to cope.
Yeah, so thank you very much. So one last question. I'll sneak in two parts to this question, though. So now I'm thinking a lot about long term. Now, hopefully, you know, we're always optimistic, but hopefully we're coming near the end of at least this first phase of COVID. But we're then beginning now to think more and more about some of the long-term mental health consequences of the pandemic. So what do you think some of those will be? That's part A of the question. And part B is, what can we do to best mitigate some of those negative consequences we might be seeing? So I'll start with Joanna.
Sure. So, you know, one thing we haven't talked about yet is there has been an increase in substance use, alcohol use in particular, amongst adults and especially amongst parents of children and youth. And this is a really important piece for us to pay attention to going forward. Definitely some of the research shows that some of that alcohol consumption is around coping. And, really that's not an optimal coping strategy. And so I think that's going to be something important for us to focus on. One of the ways that can be really helpful is to develop other more healthy coping strategies. And I think we're going to need to really have that, and exactly the kind of thing you're doing today, broad scale support for the population in developing coping strategies will be important. I think it's also going to be important for us to take another look at some of our institutions that are important in the lives of young people, and think about what are some of the changes that may have happened that we want to hold on to into the future as well. Because some of the changes that have happened as a result of the pandemic have actually been experienced as positive by some young people. So I remember, for example, a young person with autism talking about how now they get to participate in things like concerts where they've never been able to do that before because in-person concerts were too overwhelming, but now they can join online. So there are these really important pieces that we're probably going to want to embed in our future that have actually had positive impacts as well.
Wonderful, thank you. And Emily, I'll get you, but just a little bit of a side here, just as you both are talking, what comes to mind, of course, is as we've been curating the show for the youth art, is how much the art itself was that coping mechanism, how much enriching the arts and music, et cetera, and some things that I'm sure Emily will, perhaps touch on as well, but how this kind of work, a lot of the strain was, they channel it through your art, and oftentimes, in describing what they did, it was very much therapeutic for them. And it sounds to me, Joanna, what you're saying is it's not just coping in the moment, but also long-term coping and the ways in which arts and cultures and cooking and baking, whatever these things, they can actually be, good for all of us moving forward as well. So
exactly. And when you think about sort of like those broad population-based initiatives, and we think about, over the last decades, cutbacks in terms of music education and arts education embedded in our school system, that's exactly the kind of thing we need to be thinking about. It's not just about mental health treatment services. It's in fact embedding these important pieces into our broad population-based approaches.
Right. So it's seen not so much as extra that can be cut, but core to who we are and to our survival during moments like this. But let me pass it on to Emily. Your thoughts on this. Once again, the long-term mental health consequences and how we can best cope with those consequences.
Yeah, I mean, I resonate with so much of what Joanna and you, Justin, have also said about this. And, I think to go back to that sort of individualized experience and thinking about the fact that the way that we all can cope in a healthy way with our mental health challenges is so individualized. And so really having these conversations and broadening our perspective of what mental health support really can look like and what preventative care can look like. And that it's not necessarily like traditional talk therapy for everybody, right? I think when people think of mental health and going to therapy, it's still this very one-way sort of perspective that some people have, especially for people who don't have a lot of experience in mental health care. And so really taking time to share with the public what their full spectrum of options are, and to encourage people to really get curious and creative about what are the ways that will best support them as an individual in their own mental health and wellness. And again, as Joanna said, looking at what are the services that are available to people and what are the services that people have access to. From a music therapy perspective, I think about the fact that music therapy largely is not covered by OHIP and is not covered by a lot of private health insurance. So unless you're receiving music therapy at a hospital or in a long-term care home where it's being funded by that individual facility, if you want to seek out private music therapy or even for private talk therapy for a lot of people, that's money coming out of your own pocket. And so I think for those of us who are in the field and those who are not working in the field but who are passionate about mental health support, pushing for that increased access to supports for the people who need it most, because often the people who need it most are not the people who have easy access to those services.
Wonderful, thank you. Yeah, and so in some ways, I always think looking at the guitar behind you, for example, you always look at people's backgrounds here. But you know, that simple advice: take a hike. You know, pick up the guitar, bake something. You know, of course, that's one step. And of course, there's all sorts of therapy and skills in order to be able to operationalize that, etc. But I think it's so important sometimes that we tend to think, okay, yeah, well, I've got to fix this. You know, I've got to give up guitar. You know, realizing that in some cases it might be that guitar which you have to double down on in order to sort of work through these things. That sometimes it's not, you know, not the frontal assault. Sometimes that we think we can solve this, but through working through our issues, our concerns in different ways. So that's, I think, a little bit of what I'm hearing from both of you. I think we've got about 2 minutes, so I'll break the mold here and see if there any last thoughts that either one of you have. Emily, why don't I start with you? You know, maybe a minute or so. We'll do like a debate style here. But any closing thoughts about this before we throw it up to the Q&A?
Yeah, I think, you know, thinking about what you just said, Justin, too, I think sometimes as adults, we look at the things that are fun and enjoyable for us, that allow us to be creative and playful, and we're not comfortable pursuing those things just for the sake of that play and creativity and self-expression, whether that's music or baking. It's like, oh, well, it's not legitimate, or it's not real, or something I'm allowed to pursue unless it's something that I'm good at, right? But I really just would encourage everyone to think about those things that really make you feel good. You know, that are healthy things, right? Like I'm talking, you know, music, baking, all of those little self-care things that you do, and to dive into those and to not be afraid of using them just for the sake of feeling good and being kind to yourself and playing and expressing.
Thank you. Wonderful. Joanna, any last thoughts?
Yeah, I would just like to sort of riff off of what Emily was saying earlier around the need for access to services. And I think with youth in particular, that distinction between mental health services per se and these broader sort of aspects of well-being is not there. And that's our opportunity. You know, we young people come to us as whole people, and we need to see them as whole people, and we need to create spaces in our community you know, where they're able to access all kinds of different services in terms of their well-being, and they need to be able to do that equitably and easily.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, thank you both for the conversation, and Joanna, especially as you were talking about resources. I think that we're going to go ahead and put up a few slides here as we transition to the Q&A that will show some of the resources that are available both through CAMH and the Musical Therapy Center. And so I believe that Erin's going to put these into the chat, or she's already done that. But you know, these are also resources where you can get a lot more information about music therapy, about mental health, etc., and some of the challenges that youth are facing, and as we've I think hit on time and time again, that all of us are facing here now and in the months ahead. So thank you very much for you both for joining us in the program. And you know, I encourage everyone to come to the museum soon. This exhibit, My Pandemic Story, will be opened up October 23rd. We have a mass show that's opened up now at the museum. It opened up, I believe, on Saturday. And so now we're going to go into the Q&A section. So we'll be answering some of your questions. And as a reminder, please there's a Q&A feature there. You see that at the bottom of your screen. Just go ahead and type your question into there, not in the chat, but in the Q&A on the far right. And what we can do is we'll open that and try our best to answer as many questions as you might have about mental health, the pandemic, art, music, whatever you'd like to talk about. We'd love to have a conversation. So we'll wait for our first question. I could also provide some questions as well, to stir the pot. One thing, what I'd like to bring it back to, and what I was struck by, and maybe you both can speak about this, because we've talked a lot about sort of physical activity, be it playing a guitar, be it walking, and I'm kind of curious in terms of the sort of tactile or the motion, the sort of activity of it, and how that that deals with sort of the mental, so sort of the psychological and the physical, and that combination. It seems so much of it is actually beginning to do something that in part is not directly dealing with what you think your mental health, which is up here somewhere, but somehow gets to that. So I'm interested in that kind of connection, and your thoughts on that. So I don't know who, I haven't organized who goes, but someone can start and go from there.
So I can take a couple of things that come to mind, and I know Emily has fantastic knowledge and expertise to share also about some of these pieces. But I think we can think in terms of different levels. So at one level, there's sort of what is happening going on up there, as you describe, and so at the sort of like cognitive level of things. For some young people who are really struggling, part of what they're struggling about are thoughts that they're having, thoughts and emotions that they're having. They're big emotions. They're thoughts that continue even though they don't want them to continue. They repeat over and over again. And part of what we try to do when we work with young people is to help them disconnect from that thinking and help them to pay attention to something else, engage in something else, engage those cognitive resources in something else that will de-emphasize what's going on in their heads, or in their brains. And so, something like music, art, physical activity, those kinds of things require your full attention. And so, especially physical activities like playing a guitar that require your full attention, then force you to disconnect from what's going on in your head. At the other level, it's also about stress management. But I think Emily has a lot of expertise around the physiology of music and wellness. So I'll turn it over to Emily.
Yeah, thanks, Joanna. That's a great intro into sort of what I can speak to specifically with music. And there's so much science behind the way that music interacts with our brain and body. So I want to share just a couple of little tidbits because we could go on about the science for a really long time. But in terms of, the act of physically making music, there's a couple of things. For one thing, when we listen to music, when we hear music that we find pleasurable, our brain gets a dopamine hit, and dopamine is a neurotransmitter in the brain that is very highly linked to our experience of pleasure. So for one thing, listening to music literally in your brain helps you to feel more pleasure if it's music that you enjoy. Another thing in terms of the physiological aspect of music is that we know that music, there's a concept called musical entrainment, which is the way that our brain fires in time with music as we hear it. And so we can actually use music to help regulate physiological responses like respiration rate and heart rate. And so actually playing music or even listening to music can be a valuable way to help regulate those physiological responses that you might be having if you're anxious, for example, if your heart is racing, if your breathing is fast. Listening to music, really we recommend at a gradually slower pace, and trying to time your breathing with the music can be a really valuable way to help self-regulate. So those are just a couple of ways that music interacts with the brain, particularly as it involves, our physiology.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, so I do have the questions are rolling in here. So let me start with the first one I see. And the question is about, can you talk a little bit about COVID fatigue? We've been in the pandemic so long, and how do active older people deal with this? So anyone want to take a stab at that one?
So I think it's a common experience across many people. And we see sort of the results of it in a variety of different ways. We've seen it in terms of people, you drift away from things that were highly sort of engaged, like got you highly engaged at the beginning, in terms of even things like wearing a mask or public health, participating in public health restrictions or following public health restrictions. And we see drift because you get that sense of this is never ending. And so it's important to sort of, for people to be checking in around where they're at on those kinds of things. But I think from a mental health perspective, I think we have seen, broadly speaking, that people are struggling with feeling disconnected from things that used to make them feel energized, losing interest in things that they used to engage in for pleasure and recreation. And so, I think what I would say to people is, even if it doesn't feel you don't feel inspired right now, it is important to try to take the time to engage in some of those things. And starting with things that you used to find engaging or positive are a good place to start often. Of course, at an individual level, it could be, there's lots of individual variability, but reconnecting with things you used to enjoy, because getting out of the habit of some of those things can make it really hard to re-enter. But putting that effort in can have really positive results.
Thank you. And so, Emily, I'm gonna, in order to get through more questions, I've got a music therapy question, so I'll hit you with that one. And although I think this is large implications, because it's looking at the questions about the benefits of virtual music therapy versus in-person sessions. What is good? What do you lose out on being in person through that kind of communal experience? And of course, I think this is a music therapy question, but of course, is a very much an everything question, sort of the virtual experiences versus the in-person experience. But maybe you could speak to that a little bit, Emily. Yeah,
absolutely. And of course, this is something that the music therapy profession had to figure out, just the same way everyone else figured out how to do things virtually. At the start of the pandemic, virtual music therapy really wasn't very common at all prior to the pandemic. And now we have clients who are choosing to continue virtually, even when they're able to access in-person services. And so it really varies from person to person in terms of your personal preferences. There are some differences between virtual and in-person. So for example, with in-person sessions, clients will generally have more access to musical instruments to play with their therapist. And virtually, if people are tuning in from home, they may or may not have access to those same tools. At the Music Therapy Center, we've been fortunate to have some funding to provide clients with instruments for off-site sessions. And so obviously there are some challenges there. There are still challenges with audio latency, the ways that audio doesn't line up from person to person. But largely we've found a lot of workarounds for that. We've found that clients have really been able to connect with their therapist virtually, to connect as a group in group therapy settings. I think the person mentioned a choir. So obviously choirs are a little bit different, but even in group therapy settings where people have been singing together, we usually will mute and sing along. And even just being able to see another person's face and connect, and even though you can't hear one another, I think being able to see one another's faces and know that you're engaging in the communal experience from a distance can actually still be really powerful. And so largely we found that virtual sessions have been just as effective as in person.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. And I think we have time for another question. I don't even remember when this is over. So Aaron, you can let me know. But there's conversations regarding validating activities give you personal fulfillment. In other words, finding your happy place. How do we encourage those we know are struggling to do this? What strategies would suggest to open the conversation, not only for our youth, but for adults as well? So I guess the question is, well, how do you know where you want them to go, but they're having trouble getting there, and how do you assist, I guess, them in trying to go on this journey to find their happy place? So any thoughts on that? I guess we'll start with Joanna.
Yeah, I think there is a tension point there, and it's a very apt perception of the person who posted that question. So it's usually not a good idea to say, oh, like you just need to get some sleep, you just need to exercise, because in fact, if it were that easy, of course, we'd all be in a great spot. So really what's really important when a person is talking to you or you notice that things are really difficult, validation is really important. Creating the sense in the other person that you're there for them, that you understand, that you're there to listen, that you don't have all the solutions, but you're there to work with them, support them, whatever your role is, to think with them about what some possible solutions are, but really validating how difficult it is to be in a spot where you're struggling is critically important. When people do identify things that can be helpful, one of the really helpful things that people can do is to just be with that person, go with that person. So instead of talking about playing guitar together, or playing guitar and saying like, you should go play the guitar, it's the let's play guitar. So creating those opportunities both for the social support, but also that sort of pragmatic support around actually taking the step to engage in something. Emily, you might have other things to add as well.
I think sort of in line with your answer, Joanna, and in what you were talking about before, also just remembering to start really small. When we are trying to get back into the things that used to bring us joy, or we're encouraging others to do those things, it might not look exactly the same right away, right? So if you have someone who was really passionate about playing guitar, for example, in the past, but has sort of lost that passion and interest, to just listen to some music that you really enjoyed together, or a song that the person used to play on guitar, right? Like taking those really baby steps, having a lot of grace, and remembering that these things happen slowly, and that's okay for them to happen slowly, and that it can be hard to make those big leaps for someone who is really struggling, with deep depression. So that would be my message to folks as well.
And then always thinking also about just, if you're really concerned, there are points in time when it's important to encourage someone to connect with their family doctor or to connect with other resources.
Yeah, thank you both. So let's see if I was told I had about 5 minutes left here. So one of the questions we had was, and I'll trim this down a bit, but this is one of the attendees was a 13-year-old, and that he is struggling sort of to feel safe going back to in-person classes, because he's beginning to wonder what's the point of the world if the world's changing, he doesn't know what to do in the future, all these issues. And so she's saying that other parents have similar feedback, and so the question here is, how can we help kids who have this feeling of hopelessness or helplessness as they move back, as they transition, I guess in this case, back in in-person school, but back to quote unquote more normal, but they have these lingering feelings.
Yeah, I mean, first I would say that the fact that your 13-year-old is talking to you about this is a really important piece. And keeping lines of communication open amongst family members and young people is critically important. So that's something that's a really great starting point. I think, fears about going back to school, we have actually really good evidence-based approaches to tackling anxiety and overcoming anxiety. And anxiety that has arisen in the context of fears about going into public, to school, those kinds of fears, we actually have really good approaches, effective approaches to overcoming fears. And it's a systematic sort of approach. And I would definitely encourage, if that persists, to connect, to get some support. You can some starting places are online in terms of CAMH. You can look at the resources provided by Emily as well. In terms of the hopelessness and helplessness, there can be a piece that's typical questioning that happens over the course of adolescence. It is a typical period for young people to say, like, what's the point? And typically as a parent, you often know your children best, and you can, if you have a sense that this is not that this is not just the sort of academic or intellectual exploration that happens in adolescence, it's important to connect. You even as the parent can go and talk to your family doctor. And if it persists, if it interferes with daily activities, interferes with going to school, interferes with sleep, is happening in the context of a broader concerns around mood, then I would definitely encourage you to reach out to your family doctor, have a conversation.
Wonderful, thank you. Here, so I'll do one last question here. I think we have about a minute left, and it's similar to what the question earlier, but in this case, it's from an adult looking at sort of self-care, and basically the notion is as we rejoin the workforce and as we go back in and with higher numbers into workplaces, I think the questions about self-care and the greater demands on time, et cetera, that you're having, because in some ways I think that the notion is, well, I've been doing kind of what you've been telling me to do throughout this thing, that I'm taking a lot of time to sort of manage myself. But now you have a routine, you have a way of doing things that makes sense and works within the pandemic reality. And then it's hitting this other reality of demands and of a changing workforce, and demands are sort of ramping up. So I guess the question then is, well, how do you deal with it? How do you adjust, what was working for you now that you're living in this new reality as this as things start to ramp up in terms of the responsibilities of people going into the workforce?
I'm happy to start here with this answer, and Joanna can add her thoughts as well. I think the biggest thing that I would encourage people to do, because I think people are feeling more maybe strain on their time and energy now that things are shifting and we're navigating this sort of new normal, is to really focus on those basics that Joanna was talking about earlier, right? So we think about self-care as like these extra things that we add into our day, right? Whether that is an activity that you enjoy, or we think about self-care as like a spa day or something like that, right? Whereas I think we really need to reconceptualize the term self-care as those basic things, taking care of yourself, right? Like personal hygiene, exercise, diet, sleep, those kinds of things. Start there. And then if those things are working well for you, if you're feeling good, then look at the ways that you can add those activities that you really enjoyed into your day, even in small amounts, because a little bit is better than none, right? So whether that's like, again, I'm going back to music, but it could be anything. It could be listening to your favorite songs on the way to work, or creating a playlist for yourself to help you fall asleep at night. So finding ways to put those things back into your day in small amounts and finding what works for you after you've taken care of those basics, I think is a good jumping off point.
I think a piece that I would just add would, I completely agree with that. And I think also checking in with yourself after a period of time. So it will be rough, like it's gonna be rough. And the question is, or the sort of point is to not let it be rough for a long time. You want it might be a little bit rough at the beginning, but then things should settle a little bit. And so really thinking in your head, okay, 2 weeks from now or 3 weeks from now, Thanksgiving, I'm going to take a few moments to, reevaluate. So how is it going? Have maybe a family conversation if you live with other people. How are things going? What's working well, what's not working well, and how can we adjust? As opposed to just kind of like carrying on, and then sort of really running out of steam to keep going.